In the Blue Church essay, I talked about it in the context of rowing a boat. So in the beginning, let's say you're trying to canoe. So you have one oar, and you have to have the effort of getting the physical motion of putting the oar in the water and pulling it, not tipping over the boat. And so that's a set of functions, a set of different kinds of perception and actuation capacities. You have to have some sensitivity to how your weight is affecting the weight of the boat and how your arms are moving the oar into the water. But as an individual, as a body which is coherent, it's a relatively straightforward thing to do. And you can notice this when you go from one oar to two. You go from a canoe to a rowboat. That once you add the second oar, it takes a little bit of time to figure out how to get them all together, but in not too long, you can become coherent. You can bring two oars into coherence. You can take the sensitive sensing of muscle to oar to feeling when they're in the water and pulling it in the motion of the boat, and you integrate it, and it pops. You have an insight, which is just that you bring into your body the wholeness of that, and you've integrated that into a coherent whole. And you can now actuate rowing the boat. But now you add another person into the boat, and notice that there's a significant difference there. That two people rowing a boat is a harder thing. That you have to use communication, and you have to actually practice substantially more. You have to get a sense, an embodied sense, and feeling, and say you're just rowing a canoe, because it's a little bit easier. The person in the front, the person in the back. You may even have official divisions of labor. The person in the back is steering while the person in the front is, just rowing. The person in the back's in charge. Like there's a big bunch of stuff that has to happen that enables two people to come into coherence. And you may be able to scale that to say three people. But at a certain point, you actually start seeing a phase transition where, and particularly now switch it to rowing with two oars. So you've got three people in the boat. You really do have to start doing division of labor to maintain that. You have to actually have the guy in the front, I suppose, who's yelling stroke. Because otherwise, the ability of the individuals to stay coordinated, to stay perception linked to action in a fashion that is acting as an integrated whole is not up to snuff. Like we as humans haven't got the capacity to be able to maintain that much complexity with our embodied sensorium without trying to simplify the task. So we do. We simplify agency. We actually compress the agency and the perception and the actuation agency. So what happens is you now become an instrument. You no longer have full agency over your choice making or your perception. You don't decide when to stroke. You just do it when told. And if everybody now is acting in that actuation function, and the person up front is doing at least a mediocre job of keeping a good rhythm, suddenly you're now coherent again and able to go much, much faster. Hence the trireme, the big guy with the drums. That's my vision. I'm not British, so I don't have the Oxford notion. Okay, so that's a framework. Now the reason why I want to roll out that framework is that this dynamic between complex coherence, your body integrated as a whole, and what I'm going to call complicated coherence, which is this relation of simplification and actuation through some kind of structure, is a big part of the rollout of what I've come to call Game A, which we might also call civilization. If you want to sort of start at 15, 20,000 years and up to 10 years from now, that story. And it's a story where, just like moving from one person to three people to seven people, and moving from one oar to two oars, is a story of an increase in the nature of the lived environment that our structures of sense-making and choice-making and actuation are endeavoring to be coherent in, and to therefore give us the capacity to operate in effectively as a group. The Blue Church emerged in the context of having to figure out how to navigate all of these changes and generate coherence. How do we get all of these people with these new capacities to be able to make sense of the world in some fashion that is able to then make choices together and to act effectively? Right? That's the question. And the Blue Church developed to be the answer to that question. Right? So it developed the ability to say, for example, use the education system to establish an embodied sense of vertical meritocratic hierarchy. Right? The idea that some people are better at others in knowing certain kinds of things. We can find them, and then we empower them to have hierarchical authority in the structure that we're in. And I should say this, by the way, both formally and informally. The role of being in class is teaching that. Whether the content of the story of the class, whatever the content of the class is, the experience of the student is the teacher's in charge. Our job is just to listen. And some of us are smart, and they get to be teachers or in charge, right? That's the story of school. And it's very important, that first part, that there's a relationship between authority and receptor that has a broadcast modality. So the Blue Church is very broadcast across its entire mode. So what I mean by broadcast, of course, is exemplified in television, which is to say that some small number of people get to speak, and a very, very large number of people get to listen. And this is very different than say, what we're doing right here. This is symmetric. While, of course, I'm the one speaking, in principle, there's nothing about this conversation that couldn't be perfectly symmetric. But in television, in any kind of broadcast modality, it's structurally that way. So Walter Cronkite tells the news, and everybody else watches it. And there's a lot of passivity there. Like, my job is not to perceive what's going on, make sense of it, and then express it in the world. My job is to see the story that I'm being told and be able to then express that story effectively in the society that I'm in. And I call this good sense, the emergence of good sense. And you see an emerging mesh of good sense. Who are the authoritative speakers, whether they're NBC News or they're the New York Times? And there's a diversity, of course. There's a variety of different perspectives in the authoritative framework. The Blue Church recognizes the necessity of having eyes and ears, but it also recognizes the necessity of having coherence. So there's a diversity, but there's a diversity within a particular boundary. And so when you show up in society, if you are speaking good sense, if your expressions are of the sort that everybody else has broadly been hearing, or the authoritative statements, then you're showing up well. And if you aren't, then you're showing up poorly. And you'll notice that. Like, if you begin to say things that are contra-narrative in a deep way, even today, much less so now, though, than like 30 years ago, then you will notice a discomfort. People get uncomfortable, viscerally, physically. And you will notice that discomfort viscerally, physically, and then you'll stop doing it. And so there's a nice policing mechanism that just at the cocktail party set, particularly in places like, say, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco, where the elite cachet is the most important, where the choice of social success is the choice between being elevated in the hierarchy or not, then good sense becomes even more self-policing.
Good sense or good opinion?
Sorry, good opinion. Thank you. Good opinion. And it's actually interesting to make that distinction, because the effort of the Blue Church is actually to provide good sense. Right? What is the truth about the war in Vietnam? But of course, what it can only produce is good opinion. What is our perspective? And then make sure that everybody more or less has that. Because then you can actually have choices. You can actually make choices together. If we all more or less agree that this is the nature of reality, and we more or less agree that these kinds of actions will lead to effective results, then we're rowing the boat to the coxswain's yell. We're pushing. We have a menu that has 6 buttons. Pick which button you'd like to push. You have choice, no question. But it's in a constraint. Right? It's within a boundary condition that works. And then what happens is when you push the button, it actuates a whole lot of stuff. We've all decided that we're going to have a war on poverty. So we turned the dial on the World War II era bureaucratic machinery that took us to the moon, that built the interstate highway system, and we said, okay, go out and point that engine at poverty. We're going to start building the welfare state. Go. Right? And that's what they did. And sometimes it worked. You pointed it at the moon and it got us to the moon. You pointed it at poverty and it didn't work. It really created a mess. And that tells us a lot, by the way. So I guess kind of that's that. Like, that's the Blue Church. And there's an entrainment, because this structure has Harvard is kind of at the top, and then you have the rest of the Ivy League and Oxford and Cambridge. I'm sad to say that the UK lost their position. The Victorian synthesis was a UK-centric. The Blue Church was a US-centric global sense-making system. And it was broadly global, of course, through the first 3 quarters. There was the Eastern Bloc that was doing their own thing. But starting in the late 80s, totally global. And for a little bit of time there, in fact, actually functionally global. That period from 88 to maybe 1999 was a period where the Blue Church was a true hegemon and was doing stuff.
What constitutes the Blue Church? You mentioned Harvard, but it'd be good just to sketch out.
Who's part of it? Who has hierarchy? in the Blue Church, I think is the question you're asking. Who has authority? Harvard, Ivy League universities, some of the sort of bigger think tanks, the Rand Corporation, significant governmental entities like the Department of Defense, NASA, the CIA in different domains, large corporations, GM, GE, back in the day, when that was like when what's good for General Motors is good for America. It's a very Blue Church kind of concept. It shifted to the tech sector for a little bit. Microsoft and Apple and that kind of a thing had a little bit of cachet. Some of the media structures like the New York Times, the Washington Post, really called the paper of record. The more formal, authoritative broadcast television programs, NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN for a while, like in the heyday. By the way, just to add, the Federal Reserve is a big one. The IMF is a big one, as part of the Blue Church. The Council on Foreign Relations is a big one. And by the way, these are just like real things. Like the CFR was something that was started in the 1930s as a bunch of smart people in New York thought, hey, if we get together, we can make things happen that are better than if we don't, and just kind of iterate on that. And that's kind of like the cocktail party set, but there's a feedback loop. Remember, I mentioned that I actually did some case studies. I actually went to places where fancy, rich people hung out, mostly Aspen and Necker, and other places like Hollywood. And what I noticed, at least my first person experience, was that there is absolutely for sure an elite conspiracy, which is just they all kind of hang out in the same place and like each other. But it has a characteristic. If 3-4 people, one of whom happens to be in charge of Deutsche Telekom, one of whom happens to be in charge of British Telecom, one of whom happens to be in charge of a global investment bank, one of whom happens to be a successful entrepreneur who just is looking for something to do, and they're hanging out at a dinner table in Aspen, and they just start shooting the shit. They don't have a lot to talk about because there's only certain things that they actually do, which is business and politics, but mostly business. So they start talking about business, and it turns out that if there's an opportunity for Deutsche Telekom and British Telecom to sell their mobile divisions into a new company that the bank will fund and this guy will run, you'd be surprised how rapidly that gets surfaced and identified as a thing to do. Now, growing up in the Texas Hill Country, I wasn't having those kinds of conversations, and I think most people don't. So that's an example, right? That's an artifact that emerges out of the notion of the Blue Church, that once you have a vertical hierarchy, and then by definition you have a finite amount of time, you get clusters of these people who are hanging together. And then, by the way, a lot of that human complexity creeps back in. They start having clubs, cliques. They start caring about each other. And they also start getting a lot of groupthink. That good opinion starts to really solidify, and they become blind to what's not within that good opinion.